Imagine a machine so radical that its silhouette alone could silence a crowd. Long, sharp, and alien compared to everything else around it. Picture the moment it first appears at the track. Whispers ripple, doubters shake their heads, and yet, when the flag drops, disbelief gives way to awe. This is not just a story about horsepower. It is about reshaping the rules of competition itself. At a time when rivals were locked in a war of inches, someone decided to leap by miles. With a towering wing and a nose that sliced through the air like a blade, this creation was not born to blend in. It was built to dominate. The gamble was immense. The stakes were nothing less than rewriting racing history. Over the next half hour, we'll uncover how this bold gamble turned into one of the most unforgettable legends in motorsports. If you enjoy deep dives into stories like this, be sure to like, subscribe, and comment below what machine you'd like us to explore next. The Dodge Charger Daytona 1969 is one of those machines whose very existence feels like a challenge to the ordinary. At first glance, it was unmistakably a muscle car, but with edges, angles, and appendages that looked nothing like its street-bound siblings. Within the first months of its debut, it became clear that this wasn't just another iteration of a popular model. It was a radical departure aimed squarely at one goal: winning at the highest speeds on the track. That singular focus shaped not only its design, but its legend. The Daytona carried the pressure of an entire program, desperate to prove that a leap of faith in aerodynamics could rewrite the scoreboard, and it did so with a presence that was impossible to ignore. This story begins not in the spotlight of victory, but in the shadows of defeat, when earlier attempts had left the brand-trailing rivals in the unforgiving arena of NASCAR competition. Microstory: losing the speed battle. Before the Charger Daytona 1969, the brand's racing program had been plagued by a fundamental issue. The cars had power but lacked the stability to use it effectively at high speed. On superspeedways, where aerodynamics mattered more than raw muscle, the cars simply could not keep pace. Drivers complained of lift, instability, and drag that turned every lap into a fight against the air itself. The sense of frustration ran deep. In garages and boardrooms alike, the question was whispered: what would it take to compete? That tension formed the backdrop for a bold decision, one that would usher in a completely new approach to stock car engineering. Context digest: NASCAR's Aero Awakening. By the late 1960s, the shape of a car was as critical as the engine under its hood. Long straightaways and steep banking demanded vehicles that could cut the wind cleanly and hug the track with unwavering grip. Engineers across the sport began experimenting with subtler tweaks, yet even those adjustments were often insufficient. It was clear that half measures would no longer close the gap. For the Daytona's creators, that meant starting with an idea most thought was too extreme for stock car racing. Microstory: the wild sketch on the table. Legends say that when the first sketches for what became the Charger Daytona 1969 appeared, even loyal engineers stared in disbelief. A pointed nose cone extended the front end to absurd lengths, while a massive rear wing rose higher than the roofline. It looked less like a production car and more like something out of experimental aviation. But within those lines lay a promise: reduced drag, greater downforce, and speeds that no competitor could touch. Convincing executives to greenlight the project wasn't easy, yet the sheer desperation of the racing program gave weight to the argument. What might have been laughed out of the room months earlier now seemed like the only option left. Reflection bridge. The Daytona's story is not just about engineering audacity. It is about how failure forced innovation that no one dared to imagine before. That daring led to the next chapter, proving whether the concept could actually work under race day conditions. Microstory: testing the monster. When prototypes of the Charger Daytona 1969 first hit the track, engineers held their breath. Would the long nose create too much instability? Would the giant wing actually deliver usable downforce or just ridicule? Lap after lap, the results spoke for themselves. The car clung to the asphalt in ways its predecessors never could, and speed readings came back higher than anyone had seen in this program before. Drivers who had once wrestled with unpredictable handling now found a machine that seemed glued to the track. The excitement in the pits was matched only by the disbelief from rival teams who began to understand that something very different was happening. Context digest: why the wing mattered. The most striking element of the Charger Daytona 1969, the high rear wing, wasn't a stylistic flourish. It was born of necessity. Designers discovered that a wing placed lower would be caught in the turbulent wake of the car's roofline, making it ineffective. By raising it dramatically, the wing reached clean air, generating downforce without adding excessive drag. This gave the Daytona a level of stability at 190 miles per hour that others simply couldn't match. It was a solution as outrageous visually as it was brilliant mechanically, turning skepticism into grudging respect. Microstory, the first victory. The true test came in September 1969, when the Charger Daytona 1969 entered its first major race. Fans in the stands gawked at its bizarre form, some laughing, others pointing. But when the laps began to count, the laughter fell silent. The Daytona stormed ahead, slicing through the air as if untouchable. By the end of the day, the improbable had become undeniable. The winged warrior was a winner. Its success was not just a triumph for the team, but a statement to the entire sport that boldness could prevail. Reflection Bridge. From its first wins, the Daytona became more than a curiosity. It became a force that competitors had to reckon with. That dominance soon carried consequences, both on the track and in the rulebooks. Context Digest. Setting new records. Within a year, the Charger Daytona 1969 achieved what had once been thought impossible in stock car racing, breaking the 200-mile-per-hour barrier. It wasn't just a milestone. It was a seismic shift in what fans and officials believed was possible from a stock-based machine. The Daytona wasn't merely fast, it was redefining speed itself. The accomplishment generated headlines and stirred debates about safety, fairness, and the future of the sport. Suddenly, everyone realized that racing had entered a new era, one where aerodynamics could matter even more than horsepower. Transition. Yet with dominance comes scrutiny, and with revolutionary success comes the pushback of those who fear the sport itself is slipping out of balance. That pushback sets the stage for the next chapter in the Daytona's saga. The Dodge Charger Daytona 1969 entered its second chapter as both a marvel and a menace, depending on who you asked. By the time it began racking up victories, its reputation was undeniable. This was no fluke, no gimmick, but a machine purpose-built to dominate. The very elements that made it so effective, however, also raised questions about whether NASCAR's spirit of stock racing was being stretched beyond recognition. The Daytona wasn't just competing. It was rewriting the competitive landscape in ways that rivals could not easily match, and that tension would fuel controversy on and off the track. Its triumphs set the stage for a fierce debate. Should such radical engineering be celebrated as innovation or restricted to preserve parity? The spotlight now burned brighter, and the stakes climbed higher with each race. Microstory. Rivalry turns to resentment. As the Charger Daytona 1969 streaked past competitors, frustrations mounted in opposing camps. Mechanics who had worked tirelessly to refine their cars saw their efforts rendered obsolete by a wing and a nose cone that seemed to defy the rules of engagement. Drivers voiced concerns that the competition was becoming one-sided, a battle not of skill but of science. Some argued that it betrayed the essence of stock car racing, transforming it into a contest of engineering brinkmanship rather than wheel-to-wheel grit. Rival teams began lobbying officials, and in hushed tones, questions surfaced about whether the Daytona had tipped the balance too far. Context Digest. NASCAR at a crossroads. The governing body of the sport found itself in a difficult position. On one hand, the Daytona's unprecedented speeds thrilled fans and made headlines across the nation, bringing attention that stock car racing had never enjoyed before. On the other hand, the car's superiority threatened to discourage competition if no one else could keep pace. Rules had always evolved in response to innovation, but never had a single vehicle forced such an immediate and dramatic reconsideration of what was allowed. The Daytona's performance wasn't just setting lap records, it was testing the very philosophy of the sport. Microstory. The rulebook tightens. Pressure from rival teams eventually forced officials to act. The success of the Charger Daytona 1969, along with similar aero experiments that followed, triggered new regulations that imposed restrictions on how far manufacturers could push aerodynamic designs. In practical terms, it meant the Daytona was a short-lived force, outlawed not because it failed, but because it succeeded too well. The irony was clear. The car had proved its brilliance so thoroughly that the rules had to be rewritten around it. For some, it was a bittersweet end to a brief reign. For others, it was a relief that the balance of competition might be restored. Reflection bridge. But ending its racing eligibility did not end the story. Instead, it shifted the Daytona from a threat on the track to a legend whose rarity and achievement would only grow with time. Micro-story. From track to myth. Once the Charger Daytona 1969 was removed from active competition, its scarcity transformed it into something more than a racing weapon. Collectors began to recognize that what once seemed bizarre was now historic. Only a limited number of these winged warriors existed, each one carrying the aura of its singular achievements. Owners who had initially struggled to sell them at dealerships now found themselves holding on to vehicles that would later be revered as treasures. The shift from controversial oddity to collector's grail cemented the Daytona's place in automotive lore. Context, digest, a cultural statement. Beyond the racing circuit, the Daytona's radical design resonated in American car culture. It stood as a visible symbol of an era when boldness reigned, when manufacturers were willing to gamble on outrageous solutions in pursuit of victory. Posters, magazines, and car shows celebrated its alien silhouette, turning it into a touchstone for enthusiasts who valued innovation over conformity. Its wing and nose cone became more than engineering. They were badges of defiance, proof that sometimes standing apart could lead to greatness. Microstory. The long shadow. Even decades later, the Charger Daytona 1969 continued to influence the imagination of engineers and fans alike. Its principles of aerodynamics laid groundwork for how future cars approached stability and speed. While NASCAR itself moved toward more controlled designs, the memory of what a single, unrestrained idea could achieve lingered. Every time a car approached record-breaking velocity, echoes of the Daytona's first 200-mile run reverberated in the background. Its shadow stretched not just across racing history, but across the very notion of what a car could be. Reflection bridge. From dominance to restriction, from ridicule to reverence, the Daytona's journey embodied the risks and rewards of radical thinking. What began as an experiment had now become a lasting legend. Context digest. More than just numbers. The Charger Daytona. 1969 is often remembered for its speeds and victories, but its impact extended beyond statistics. It changed the way fans saw stock car racing, injecting drama, controversy, and spectacle into every lap it touched. It reminded the sport that innovation carries both glory and consequence. And it gave generations of enthusiasts a story to tell, a tale of audacity that refused to fade with time. Transition. Yet legends are not made only in headlines or rulebooks. They endure in how they shape what comes next, and the Daytona's legacy would ripple far beyond its short-lived reign on the track. The Dodge Charger Daytona 1969 entered its final act not on the oval, but in the hearts of those who saw in it something larger than racing itself. By the time the dust settled on its short-lived competitive career, the Daytona had already secured immortality as the first stock car to break 200 miles per hour. That achievement was not just a statistic. It was a boundary shattered, a signal that the limits people assumed were permanent could, in fact, be moved. From that moment forward, every conversation about speed in American motorsports had to acknowledge the car with the wing that once looked absurd and now looked prophetic. Its story became less about winning races and more about defining what was possible. Microstory. Collector obsession. For years after the Charger Daytona 1969 left the track, dealers struggled to find buyers willing to drive such a wild-looking car on public roads. But as racing lore elevated its reputation, scarcity turned into allure. Enthusiasts began chasing down surviving examples, and prices climbed steadily. What was once an unsellable oddball became one of the most coveted machines of its era. Collectors weren't just buying a car. They were buying a piece of defiance, a tangible slice of the moment when innovation outpaced regulation. Context digest. Shaping future engineering. Even as the Daytona itself was banned from NASCAR, its aerodynamic lessons were not lost. Engineers across industries studied its solutions, from the raised wing to the extended nose, extracting principles that would inform future projects. The Charger Daytona 1969 proved that small tweaks weren't enough when battling air resistance. Bold shapes mattered, and drag reduction paired with downforce could transform performance. While NASCAR imposed limits, the broader world of performance vehicles quietly absorbed its breakthroughs. Microstory, cultural icon. Outside the track and collector garages, the Charger Daytona 1969 became a fixture of American car culture. Its image appeared in magazines, posters, and eventually on the walls of young enthusiasts dreaming of speed and rebellion. Car shows gave it center stage, and its silhouette, part aircraft, part muscle, became instantly recognizable. It represented not just a vehicle, but an era when engineers were willing to gamble on outlandish ideas, when competition was raw enough to allow one team to try something audacious and succeed. Reflection bridge. In many ways, the Daytona's cultural power grew even greater off the track than it ever could have within racing, where rule books eventually shut it down. That power carried its legacy forward into the modern age. Microstory. Influence on muscle car mythology. Among muscle cars, the Charger Daytona 1969 holds a rare dual role, both a production model and a racing legend. Its street versions carried the aura of the track, even if most would never see a checkered flag. Enthusiasts grouped it alongside other icons, but always with an asterisk. The Daytona wasn't just fast, it was outlaw fast, a machine that forced the sport to draw lines around it. That distinction only heightened its allure, giving it a mythological status among performance vehicles of its time. Context. Digest. Lessons for the sport. NASCAR's response to the Daytona's dominance was a turning point. By outlawing extreme aerodynamic designs, the sport sought to preserve competition and safety, yet in doing so, it ensured the Charger Daytona 1969 would forever stand apart as the one that went too far, too fast. This tension between innovation and regulation continues to echo in motorsports today. Every time a new breakthrough emerges, fans and officials alike recall the lesson of the winged car that changed the rules. Microstory. Lasting reverberations. Decades on, the Daytona is still referenced in discussions about racing innovation, collector value, and the thin line between brilliance and excess. Museums display it as both artifact and warning, while auctions prove its financial worth is matched only by its historical significance. Owners treat it not merely as a car, but as a talisman, evidence that once in 1969, engineers dared to chase speed without compromise. That reverence ensures its story is retold with each generation. Reflection bridge. The Daytona's impact is enduring because it straddles the worlds of engineering, culture, and myth, refusing to fade into the background as just another old race car. Context digest. The winged warrior's symbolism. Today, the Charger Daytona 1969 symbolizes a rare kind of audacity. It speaks to the human desire to leap instead of step, to shatter limits instead of edging past them. Fans don't just admire its numbers. They admire the willingness to build something that looked impossible, then prove it worked. That symbolism elevates the Daytona beyond machinery into the realm of storytelling, where it becomes a parable about courage and consequence. Transition. And so we arrive at the heart of its legacy. What the Daytona means not just for racing history, but for those who value boldness in every form, from collectors to dreamers who still look at its wing and see possibility. The Dodge Charger Daytona 1969 carries its legend not only in the numbers it posted on the track, but also in the way it shaped the ownership experience, collector market, and cultural memory of American performance cars. For anyone who encounters the Daytona today, the immediate impression is awe, followed quickly by recognition that this was a machine built for a singular purpose. As an ownership reality, the Daytona has always been unusual. Its radical nose and sky-high wing make it a magnet for attention, but they also make it an impractical daily driver. Owners quickly learned that driving one on city streets was more about spectacle than convenience. Yet that impracticality only heightened its allure, because this wasn't a car meant to blend into traffic, it was a car meant to stand apart. Collectors in the United States treat the Charger Daytona 1969 as one of the ultimate prizes. With only a limited production run, surviving examples are rare, and their value has surged accordingly. Auctions often see bidding wars not just for the hardware but for the story attached to it. To own a Daytona is to hold a tangible piece of the moment when American racing innovation reached a peak so sharp that the sport itself had to recalibrate. For collectors, it's less about mileage or restoration details, and more about being a custodian of a machine that changed the rules. For everyday enthusiasts, the Charger Daytona 1969 represents the dream of pushing boundaries. Even those who will never own one admire its audacity. Car shows, documentaries, and conversations in garages keep the story alive, reminding new generations that once upon a time, a team of engineers refused to accept defeat and instead created a shape so bold it couldn't be ignored. The cultural value of the Daytona lies in its symbolism. It embodies the spirit of daring, of turning frustration into innovation, and of proving that an outsider idea can sometimes rewrite history. From a market angle, the Daytona stands as a benchmark for how innovation translates into value. At its release, dealers struggled to sell them. Now their worth reaches into 6 and 7 figures depending on provenance. This reversal underscores how time can transform perception and how rarity combined with narrative creates enduring demand. It's a reminder that cars are more than transportation. They are artifacts of ambition, and the Daytona is one of the most compelling artifacts ever produced. In the broader legacy, the Charger Daytona 1969 laid a blueprint that continues to influence both motorsports and automotive culture. It taught competitors that ignoring aerodynamics was no longer an option, even if rules sought to limit extremes. It inspired generations of engineers to think beyond convention, and it gave fans a story that resonates with anyone who has ever wanted to see the underdog rise. It also showed how quickly innovation can be met with resistance, and how that resistance only serves to highlight the importance of the breakthrough. For American viewers, the Charger Daytona 1969 remains a symbol of an era when competition was fierce, risks were real, and rewards came to those willing to gamble everything on a single idea. It stands shoulder to shoulder with the great icons of American performance history, not because it fit the mold, but because it broke it. In the end, the Daytona's greatest achievement may not be its victories or its speed records, but its ability to capture imagination decades after it last raced. The winged warrior remains proof that sometimes the boldest move is the one that changes everything.